Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, and we'll continue our explorations into the cultures of consciousness. Last week I was reading Jeffrey Kripal's book on Esalen, his history of Esalen. We've had Dr. Kripal on the show a couple of times, and fascinating book. And there was one part that caught my attention where he was talking about this man, a professor of religion at Stanford called Frederick Spiegelberg, who was really quite influential, although nobody really has heard of him, in the sense that he was very inspiring to Michael Murphy, who went on to found Esalen, and he was also somebody who brought kind of Alan Watts to the West Coast and was part of that early 1940s, 1950s movement that put a kind of alternative spirituality or religious quest on the map. So, an interesting character, and he wrote a book called The Religion of No Religion, and in a way that's a lot of what we talk about on the show is what is religion after religion? What is quote-unquote spirituality? How do we find it? What does it feel like? Do we even want it in the fabric of our crazy days? So there's a story that Kripal tells that Spiegelberg went to visit Sri Aurobindo and his commune outside of Pondicherry in India, which is a place that Michael Murphy also spent a number of years meditating seriously, and then ultimately deciding that the guru model was authoritarian and not the way to go, and that really influenced the shape of Esalen and indeed a lot of alternative spirituality. So Spiegelberg goes, and he has kind of an experience with Aurobindo, some intense 5-second blast of darshan, but he's also pretty critical of the ashram, how it works, the authority. He's still very resistant to the kind of forms of the thing, and he certainly does not become a follower or a believer or really sign up. But there's one little comment, which is that Aurobindo's presence mysteriously and inexplicably lifted from Spiegelberg a lifetime of nightmares. That he'd been sort of plagued by nightmares his whole life, and that after this experience with Aurobindo, they were gone. And when I read this, I was like, huh. And I'm not subject to intense night terrors or repeated nightmares like some people I've known, but I regularly have extremely intense, sometimes profoundly disturbing nightmares. And I thought about this, and I go, would I choose that? And it was very clear that my answer was no. And then when I thought about why my answer was no, I really had to kind of dig deep into some kind of interesting questions that we're definitely going to be exploring on today's show. Our guest is Matt Cardin. He'll have to catch me on that one. And he's an author of horror fictions as well as a scholar of religion, and has written both nonfiction and fiction around topics particularly about horror and spirituality and or religion. And I had asked Matt to give me just a couple of key sort of representative stories. It's a busy week. I wasn't going to be able to read through his books, his most recent collection, Dark Awakenings, or the earlier book, which I think is a little tougher to track down, Divinations of the Deep. So he sent me a couple stories, and they were so terrific that I have been compulsively reading all the other ones to the detriment of my other tasks. So he's very much a person to track down, particularly if you, like me, am interested mostly or most intensely in the vein of horror that moves into realms that you would call metaphysical, philosophical, religious, spiritual, less about gore and more about the kind of edgy, ominous numinosity that exists at the edge of our dreams, of our fears, of our thought, too, of life itself to some extent. So I'm very happy that Matt is joining us today. Before that, we'll bring on our co-host here on Expanding Mind, the lovely Maja Dawu. Hey, Maja.
Hi, Erik. Ominous Numinosity.
There we go.
That's like a really good band name.
Yeah, I can hear it already. It's got the Cookie Monster vocals for sure.
I know.
Speaking of which, did you hear that the singer, what's his name, Gar from that, like, one of the classic black metal bands in Norway, just came out of the closet?
Whoa, no, I did not hear that. Wow.
I mean, this guy is like, I mean, he's real deal. He's like the heavy cat. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But do you ever have do you have nightmares? Do you?
I have had vivid nightmares that I remember from the time I was a little kid, and night terrors and sleep paralysis. I just last week had a really good one. I mean, good meaning like, you know, vivid. And they're always sensual, like I can smell and feel and taste and touch in them. So I had one, I was standing in an apartment, and a great white shark came swimming up to me in the air. It was just swimming in the air, and it came up and bit my hand. So it was like biting my hand, and I was looking at it in its eyeball. It was like staring right at me, and I had to take my other hand, and my hand was inside its mouth getting bitten off, and I choked it from the inside and the outside and had to like strangle it around its neck, and then its head kind of like deflated like a balloon, and I was able to get my hand out, but it was all like totally gnarred, and it was very gory and bloody.
Wow. That reminds me, well, I'll just throw out some, we're trading dreams. I'll be brief, but one of the nightmares that stayed with me, it was extremely apocalyptic. The world itself was being destroyed, tidal waves, cities collapsing. It was the whole sort of, fear explosion. And what lay behind it was this alien invading force of these sort of entities which were not visible, because they didn't just sort of physically come in and destroy things. They were actually a kind of reality virus that like entered into the fabric of being and destroyed it from the inside. And so it was totally terrifying. All the like typical apocalyptic visions and this sort of cosmic metaphysical horror. And then they were working through the dream. They were coming towards me. It was going to happen. There was no way this was not going to happen. They won the day. And I remember just at the moment where they were about to like absorb me, and it wasn't like I saw them, and I could just almost feel reality breaking down around me as they entered into me. Just at that moment, I had this totally clear perception that they were just another living thing in the universe attempting to propagate and survive in a cold, hostile universe. I mean, it was totally this sort of like release of the idea of evil, and instead this just kind of embrace of this naturalistic phenomena that I couldn't do anything about, and then they just consumed me. So that was pretty good. Anyway, that's a little taste of the kind of fun you can have in the nightmare realm. And let's bring on Matt to the show. Matt, thanks for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Hey, Erik. Thank you for having me. I've listened to the show for quite a while, so it is an honor to be here.
Wonderful. Well, let's stay on this topic, and because I know that you've written and researched quite a bit on the role of the nightmare as creative fodder, inspiration for writers, but also just as sort of a portal, if you will, into some of the deeper realms of our creativity, inspiration, and our psychology. So I'd love to hear a little bit about what your conclusions or some of your research has opened up.
Well, sure. Before I say anything about that, I'd like to say, number one, that ominous numinosity is maybe the best thing I've heard all week. So I appreciate your coming up with that term. I think I'm going to put that on a bumper sticker or something.
Oh, that's good.
And secondly, what you were both describing about your dreams, and Maji, your sleep paralysis experiences and such, that's some of the kind of thing that I enjoy listening to the show about. So as far as I'm concerned, I can just hang out and you two can talk among yourselves. That was already pretty interesting stuff. My particular focus on and interest in nightmares and the whole experience of night terrors and sleep paralysis and all of that as it relates to horror, and also to deep psychological and spiritual things that I think horror is a specific expression of, has come out of my own experiences with nightmares, and especially with sleep paralysis. I've talked about that some on the internet, and I've talked about that in a podcast or two and a couple of other radio shows. And in the 1990s, I personally started being hit out of the blue with what I did not know to call sleep paralysis, and it involved the the visionary attacks and assaults and visitations by a demonic-seeming shadow figure. And it lasted for a while. It was episodic over years, and it really upended my own worldview and my own experience of life. I mean, it's sort of, the way I've explained it before is it kind of like punched a hole in my psyche. I really found all this dark mood and outlook and set of thoughts and conceptions that came with it. And I'd always been a very spiritually and philosophically minded person before that. I minored in philosophy in college and almost decided to take a major in it, and had been reading obsessively in both supernatural horror fiction and philosophy and religion and so on for years on my own after college. So when all these nightmares started hitting, it started interacting, and these sleep paralysis visions and experiences hit, it interacted with all of my interest in supernatural horror and philosophy, and kind of led me to begin, over the course of a lot of years, intuiting a pretty deep connection among them all. So there's the beginnings of an answer. Do you want me to keep on going, or do you have any questions?
I think it feels like there's sort of two ways we can go here. One is towards the way that this manifests in horror, and the way that these terrifying experiences can become material for creativity, and that there's something, if not redemptive, about that creativity. There's certainly something very rich and very powerful about it, both for readers and for writers, and for the kinds of experiences, literary experiences that it can produce. I mean, I know that I too, like a lot of people I know who are spiritually minded, and particularly wrestle with some of the bigger amoral problems that come up with religion, that there's a real potent charge to horror fiction in general, and it's something you've also explored, obviously, in the fiction that's come out, probably these experiences. But at the moment, I think I'd rather go into this sort of religious or philosophical realm, because that's a little bit that's much less explored. I mean, when people think about being a religious person or a spiritual person, someone interested in religion, someone interested in the experiences of numinosity, of meditation, of the sort of oneness with nature, there's this kind of just broad-based assumption that those things, unless those things are totally BS from a hardcore skeptical point of view, we'll leave those guys aside for now. But otherwise, there's just sort of a general assumption this is good stuff. It's going to make you feel good. It's going to show you the underlying realm of love, or the deeper meanings behind the mundane surface of our crazy world. But what I've gone through my own reading, and certainly the things you've written and explored on your own, is that it's more complicated than that, and that there's something in the religious quest and the spiritual quest that goes right through these very harrowing places. And so I'm just sort of curious on your own path, how you found your way through that valley of shadows.
Well, I don't think I actually found my way through it. In my experience, and then in that of the people that I have sought out, both in person and in reading books and in watching films and looking at other art and so on, it's not something that you just pass through and come out and say, well, I'm glad that's over. It's something that becomes kind of a permanent dwelling place. I was talking about a changing of my particular center point or fulcrum point, and a changing of my worldview. Well, a large part of what that involves is exactly what you're talking about, and I really resonate with what you're saying when you're talking about how it's so standard to take the very idea of religion and spirituality and act as if it's all about lightness and good and comfort and solace and reassurance and all that kind of thing. And there's a standard sort of a Freudian and otherian diagnosis of religion that says, basically religion is all based on the fear of death, so Western religion anyway is founded on the idea that people want to survive after death and all that. So therefore it's all about, comfort, getting away from our worst fear. Anybody who talks in that direction, anybody who looks at it that way, is basically looking at it with a horrible historical and psychological and spiritual myopia, because that view of religion is historically a baby. It's an infant. Religion throughout the world and throughout history has always been about what today when you hold it up against the common Western and especially American religious view today, looks very dark at times, or sometimes all the way through. You have certain religious traditions and aspects that are very, very dark and bleak, like at their core, like the Gnosticism of the first century CE and second century CE, where the Gnostics looked at the physical cosmos as pretty much this trap that had been created by this demiurge god, this imposter of a creator who had trapped all of us when we are really spirits. We're trapped in this hell realm of matter. So this inferno of eating other life to survive, and all the despair that we sense at being separated from each other and so on is just hideous. It's awful. Well, horror was at the center of Gnosticism, and you can look at many other religious traditions, right? But even within the ones that we think are about light and sweetness and so on, like Christianity, for example, I was raised a very devout evangelical Protestant, and I didn't exactly notice consciously as I was being raised that way that all throughout the Christian scriptures there are parts where miracles will happen. And there's not just the Old Testament things, by the way, where, oh my gosh, a miracle happens and people are overcome with awe. That's the direction I'm headed. In the New Testament, Jesus does a miracle, and it doesn't say, and everyone just thought, isn't that the most wonderful thing in the world? No, that's not what happens. An angel comes down, or Jesus does a miracle and walks on water, or when the angel, when the stone rolls away from the tomb where Jesus is buried, and we have the Roman centurions there in one of the Gospels. The centurions are overcome with horror and dread, and they pass out. Or when Jesus walks on water and his disciples see him, they don't say, "Hey, wonderful, it's Jesus." They're terrified, and it uses those words.
And they accuse him of being Satan, too. Like, they accuse him of being satanic or demonically possessed as well.
At one point that happens, but in fact, that is with the Pharisees are basically not liking it in the telling of the canonical Gospels where that happens, where he sets up against their religious authority, and they say, oh, it's a demon who's enabling him to heal people and so on and so forth. Yeah, that happens, but the thing that I guess interests me is that the very displays of supernatural power are occasions where people are overcome with fear and trembling and awe and dread. And that goes right through Judaism, and you have some of the same sentiments in Islam, and you can get senses of this sort of, you might call it demonic divine power, even in the Eastern traditions. So I think what you see is that in the wider historical view of religion, the global view, it's always been right there in the center of the very same things that supernatural horror plays on, this sense that the reality that we see around us and that seems solid and everyday and so on and so forth has something else lying behind it, and there isn't necessarily something great and wonderful and comforting about that reality. The very confrontation with that seems to be, in a lot of the religious expressions, something that intrinsically calls out this sense of dread and this sense of horror and this sense of trembling. I discovered that all of this kind of lit up for me. Suddenly I can't look at religion and study religion anymore without that being the thing that jumps out at me.
Absolutely. I was just reading Rudolf Otto, which, is one of those writers who, the vast majority of people who come across his name just, you get the little one-paragraph summary of his idea, sort of like one big idea on the numinous as something that has both fear and dread and, awesome beauty kind of contained within it, the sort of, a sort of mixture or blend of these different kinds of affects that have those elements, and he's really finding it in the Christian tradition. And what kind of blew me away when I actually read the book was how much of his perspective is very traditionally Christian, and it's not like he's some razzle-dazzle outsider or proto-Eliade kind of guy who's like interested in the whole range of religious experience. He is interested in that whole range, but he discovers it really almost within human beings. He really wants to say that we have a kind of function, a capacity, a sort of fundamental structure that is religious, but it is religious not just in the light sense, but in the sense also of cosmic dread, of terror, and that what you see through religions are different ways of organizing it. But the way that I think about it sometimes is, that if you're a Christian, or you have a view where there's like where God is good, and then you have to have some kind of idea of what's bad, you have to deal with the other side. So you have to think about, so when I meet a Christian or someone who has that kind of perspective, comes from a monotheist perspective, my first question is like, so what is the devil? What does the dark side look like? Are there demons or are there not demons? Well, some people, no, that's just a metaphor for whatever. And you're like, really? Interesting. Okay. Because there always seems to be a way in which those images attach themselves to our idea of religion as a source of light or a source of solace and comfort. And then on the flip side, you have, and in a way this is even more interesting to me than these more traditional religions, is you have a lot of modern ideas that, of course, have their own historical links of non-dualism, that ultimately it's all one. Subject and object are linked in some ultimate field that when you scrape away this world of polarity and diversity, that there's this kind of singular field. But if that's the case, then the most evil things that you can think of, things people do, the horrors in nature, the insects that put their young inside the bodies of other creatures that you feed out, the sort of like seething horror of nature, it's like it's all part of the same thing, man. And you're like, that is a tough ride. I mean, you really have to have big arms to embrace all that stuff without pretending it's not there. And
great white sharks are part of God too.
Yeah. And some of the stuff that you point to in your stories is almost like there's a kind of meditative aspect too. There's a way in which it's not just about the mythology of the horror of this world, but that even in these sort of fundamental states of consciousness that people seek to cultivate in spirituality, through meditation, through overcoming the subject-object dualism, even in that stuff, there's some dark shadows lurking. Was that stuff that you kind of discovered partly through your own personal explorations, how this experience of night terror sort of revised your own explorations in spirituality and religion?
Well, yeah. I mean, I was always one of those people, and I get the sense that both of you were and are just like me. I was always one of those people that it wasn't possible for me to just take the religion that was given to me sort of as rote. A lot of people are born into a religious tradition, and they were raised in it, and it just seems normal to them, and we all have a certain amount of that. But then there's a bunch of us who it seems like it really takes to a greater extent. It impresses itself upon us, and we're consciously interested in those things. So when I was having the nocturnal experiences, and I think what's going on with me unconsciously was that I was sort of driven to read supernatural horror and really be into Lovecraft and some other things. I discovered Ligotti not long after all this started. And what drove me to be fascinated with the really metaphysical, weird fiction expressions of horror fiction was the very same thing that was driving me to be interested in religion and spirituality. So that when I sort of started having this weird recasting of the way I kind of relate to the world and myself and so on, yeah, it all came together. And what struck me was that exactly what you're talking about. I mean, I've been fascinated with non-dualism for years, and I was almost weaned on Alan Watts and the whole Neo et Beta movement. I'm right in there. I'm reading the books and I'm looking at the websites and watching the films, and I find it all fascinating, and it's kind of part of my own spirituality. But like you said, that necessarily the whole non-dual idea necessarily means, like you said, Maja, the great white sharks are God too, and not just that. When they are ripping the flesh of some other creature, whether it's a fish or a human being, that's God too. And the horror that is being experienced when that's happening, that's God too. And it seems like if you're reading religion and spirituality and horror and all this stuff is going on, you suddenly start thinking, wait a minute, the dualistic division into God and devil, the good and the bad, and you want to ally yourself with the one side and not with the other, really represents a distinction that is not necessarily valid, and that in fact only came about in late Judaism and with Christianity. Like the ancient Jews, for example, as Carl Jung famously liked to point out, had a real spiritual, psychological holism, a holistic view going on where all of the experiences in life, both the good and the bad things, were clearly inhering in Yahweh. You know, you have those verses in Isaiah and elsewhere. I, the Lord, I, Yahweh, alone bring happiness and sadness. I alone bring, you know, prosperity and famine, all that kind of, light and darkness. So what you're really seeing when you get into all of this stuff, if you start seeing it from this point of view, you can't stop, by the way, is that all of the divisions we customarily make into these polarities that we try to then align ourselves with one side can't be done. Ultimately, you are doing it. You always, to use like a Douglas Harding type term, you always stand upstream from any of those divisions you're making.
Well, and it's really hilarious to me because if you do, like you said, with Judaism, if you track back in the history of every single religion, without exception, they all stem from those monistic kind of ideas that transcend dualities. Like all the shamanic cultures in every single part of the world. You got the Bardo in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. You got the Book of the Dead in Egypt, and they all look at those parts and those things, and it's included in the whole to-duty, you know, and there's not that distinction of like, well, this is good and this is bad and you should do this and this is, you know, we can't do that. And I mean, so what do you think really happened? I mean, I know that's a ginormo question, but why is, as religion develops, does it break into those two things, do you think? Like that it goes away from that shamanic concept of including everything, and then all of a sudden when these religions develop, it busts into two all across the board with Judaism, Christianity, you know, Muslim. It all starts to like rip apart into these segregated things. Like, what is it? Civilization? Is it for power? Like, what do you think is the impetus of that?
I'll give two separate answers, and I'm going to take one of my favorite tactics and sort of put in a virtual hyperspace holding place what I actually think, because what I actually think so often comes down to me just talking about what someone else thinks, because what I actually think lies in the space somewhere between them. That may sound like a cop-out, but this is where it is.
No, that's good.
You mentioned Otto, Erik, and of course any conversation that is informed about these things has to go to Rudolf Otto and his book, The Idea of the Holy, right?
Yeah.
And as you were saying, Otto is the pretty renowned early 20th century religious scholar who came up with an idea about the origin of religion that has become one of the semi-canonical ways that scholars of horror fiction and theorists of horror have come at the matter, because he said that spiritual experience, religious experience, like within the individual human psyche, is a sui generis emotion or mode or experience. It is categorically something of its own, can't be reduced to or explained by something else. And when he got at it, fascinatingly, he said that he thought you could sort of trace both historically and philosophically and psychologically the origin of religion itself backwards to what he called an experience of demonic dread, you know, D-A-E-M-O-N-I-C, the wider meaning of demonic. And he pointed out, which is totally fascinating, he said both the later elaborations of this sort of primary, primal, unstructured religious emotion of awe and dread and fear and trembling before this sense of this all-encompassing demonic mystery. It's both its elaboration into the higher religions, as he called them, and its elaboration along an alternative track into ghost stories and stories of supernatural horror, which he viewed as rather debased, show that both of those come from the same root, and so ultimately you can find a kinship between supernatural horror and religion. But his view of where all the separate religions came from in Christianity and so on was that they were ever finer and higher sort of evolutionary articulations of what this impulse always wanted to become. So that's one answer, is they start from this sense of this just primal, unstructured sense of demonic dread, and then they're meant to evolve into the higher expressions which actually convey more of their truth. On the other side, you can look at sort of the devolution model, and both of you are familiar with like Richard Tarnas, right, and The Passion of the Western Mind and all that. You know, he structures that whole look at Western intellectual, philosophical, religious history around almost like a punchline, where at the end Tarnas wants to read all of Western history, and I think all of human culture and consciousness in general, as kind of a long playing out of like the prodigal son story, where we have that that primary motif of a separation from some primal unity of things, and progressive modes of separation and devolution, where that could be like differentiations of ideas. And in Christianity, you could look at splinterings of denominations and sects and that kind of thing. You could look at ever greater complexity and articulation of political systems and the way civilization has tended in that direction. In the end, it's all leading to some sort of crash point, which some people want to say we're at now. You have an over complexity and that kind of, you're entering collapse mode. And actually, what's going to have to happen is that these religions find that they've reached a terminal point from which there is no greater distance they can go from that original recognition of the underlying unity of the supernatural and transcendent things they want to say are totally opposed. On the one hand, all these things are higher articulations of some sort of primal thing that was lower and crude. On the other hand, you have the idea that everything is much more devolved and fallen away from what it should be, and there will be some kind of redemption. Where do I fall on that? Well, somewhere in the middle, like I said. But I think the idea that this sort of recognition that something like what Freud called the uncanny lies at the base of it all, because you realize there really is a primal unity of the things we want to separate into good and evil and God and devil and so on are really together. I think that's there, and it totally upends our sensibility. It doesn't do what we want it to do, and I think it can sort of crack open our own little cosmic egg.
Yeah, but the attempt to just sort of say, everything is one and that's all groovy and we're part of one big holistic system is a kind of a simple veneer of something that I think takes a heck of a lot more work to really take on in its fullness. Well, these are just
it can be a cop-out, yeah, it can be if you do it wrong.
And, these are just great discussions here, but we're going to take a break right now and come back for more. You're listening to Expanding Mind with Erik Davis and Maja Daou. We're talking with Matt. And how do you say your last name, Matt?
It is Cardin. C-A-R-D-I-N, Cardin.
Matt Cardin, and we'll be back after this.
Welcome back to Expanding Mind on the Progressive Radio Network. This is Maja Daou, and we're here with Erik Davis, talking with Matt Cardin about terrible, horrible, awful things, because these things need to be discussed. And you said something, Matt, I totally agree with everything you said, and it is interesting to see how the kind of religions doing this, going into complexity and then kind of falling apart. It seems to me like it's just following biological kind of structure as well. It just, everything is the same process over and over and over again, from a cell becoming a person to a star turning into a galaxy. It all just kind of follows the same thing. But you said something that Otto stated about kind of the origin of it, which is that the origin of religion and spiritual experience having to do with that demonic, terrifying experience. And as you mentioned, it's demon, D-E-A-M-O-N. And I wanted to kind of talk about that concept a little bit, since that's a biggie. If he says, that's the origin of religion, he's saying that's it right there. Well, let's look at that. What is this horrifying demonic experience that you can have that kind of links you to it? And for me personally, a lot of that came with the sleep paralysis, and some of the nightmares that I would go through would be this demonic thing that was there, present as an entity, like you described, having this kind of shadow figure that you were dealing with. And when I was younger, I came across this book that helped me a lot called Demons, Nightmares, and Witches. I don't know if you've read that one, but it talks about...
I don't think I have.
It talks about the psychological implications of sleep paralysis and the idea of the incubus and the succubus, right? So a lot of people may have heard about incubus and succubus, but a lot of these experiences that people have not only have that kind of dark, demonic nature to them, but they're also psychosexual as well, right? Because you have the idea that there's this thing, this dark presence that's there, and not only is it menacing or trying to make you not breathe or possibly trying to suffocate you or drink your blood like a vampire. That's the word nightmare comes from the mare, which in Jewish religion they're like these vampires kind of things. But then there's also that sexual aspect where they also, take your semen or, kind of have that thing that exhausts you, and it's mostly talked about with men in culture, but it happens to women as well with the incubus. And I was wondering if that was kind of like a part of any of your research too, and trying to like identify these demons or some of their nature, if you ever like kind of got into any of that.
I have read a lot about that type of thing. I haven't read the book that you mentioned. It sounds interesting.
Yeah, I can't remember the author, but I think it's Nightmares, Demons, and Witches.
I will be heading to my search engine after we get off the phone here. I haven't actually gotten into in my own specific focus, as far as like the specific research and writing that I do. I haven't gotten into looking at that kind of thing, but it does that the experience of, like you said, the psychosexual aspects with the succubus and incubus experiences, which those are like the Christian names under which those entities or experiences were known. But that type of thing with a sexual assault by what is perceived to be a spiritual presence that attacks you while you're sleeping, that's cross-cultural and universal and older than recorded history, apparently.
Yeah.
I think the experience itself we do have to read as going back to the same sort of psychological unity and the duality, light side, dark side within that unity that we're talking about, because you have something that is the basis of life and that is a physical expression of the closest that two human beings can get to each other in intimacy, and suddenly it's something that what is perceived to be a supernatural, metaphysical, evil force is using to attack you. The type of demonic with a DAE, demonic experience that Rudolf Otto was talking about, I think, as the origin of religion and human religiosity, was, I think, a bit wider in that he was using the term both because it was sort of the more common way to write the word in some scholarly circles at the time that he was writing, and also because when you add the AE in there instead of just the DE, you are invoking the history and the resonances of a wider meaning of demons. Demonic with just a DEMONIC has come to mean simply something to do with evil spirits.
Yeah.
The demonic with the DAE is actually sort of a Latinization of the Greek term daimon that we transliterate in English DAIMON. And there were two senses of that in antiquity, and one of them was just the daimones were these spirits, sort of like from any animistic tradition that anthropology has studied, that inhabited various places and sort of dictated certain weird events and might annoy you or help you or whatever. But in the Platonic philosophical tradition, which was, as I think you both know, sort of an instantiation of a much wider Gnostic with a little g, general Gnostic tradition, the daimon, or what was later called the demon, became known as was framed as this thing that was like the guiding spirit or the inner character, the inner spiritual character of someone that was given to them as like this attending spirit by the gods before they were born. And,
it was kind of like a guardian angel, right?
Yeah, I mean, the holy guardian angel of like the Golden Dawn and all that stuff is directly a modern instance of that, and the ideas of the genius as like a guiding spirit rather than just a super smart person, that all comes from that.
Well, I want to jump in here with this idea of genius, because I know one of the aspects of your work that's really interesting is you have a kind of a model of thinking about daemonic creativity. And, there's a lot of ways to go with this in terms of how it can inspire one's own writing, one's own thinking. I mean, for me, a lot of the more horrific experiences that I've had, which have been luckily mostly more in my head than in reality, have really been fodder for thinking and engaging and wrestling with a lot of these questions that we've been talking about. But I'm also interested in almost more the texture of the experience itself. I mean, I kind of want to hear a little bit more about your own sleep paralysis and how that shadowy figure changed for you, and how you came in the end to kind of understand or work with whatever that kind of contact is, because in some ways the most striking aspect of, let's say, dreams is regardless of how utterly bizarre the experience is, or whatever kinds of emotions and unusual worlds you're in, revelations about the nature of the cosmos, et cetera, in some ways the most remarkable aspect is this unshakable sense of another presence, whether it's daemonic, whether it's good, whatever it is, but this sense that there's like, how could that possibly be just some little subunit running in my neural stem somewhere? It's just it's impossible to put away. Like, you have to kind of deal with it as an encounter, regardless of where your ultimate metaphysics lie with materialism versus larger spiritual view. There's something about that encounter, and I feel that in your writing and the way you talk about demonic creativity. So I'd love to hear you maybe speak a little more personally about how you worked with the sense of a kind of demonic force in your own life and writing.
Well, sure. Well, what happened was that as I sort of found that the horror that I was feeling and that would hang on for hours and hours was just like this sort of psychic fog or something after I would have one of those experiences, pretty much came eventually to link up seamlessly from night to day to night there for a while, and I feared I was losing my mind, and I sort of had this sense of being out of place and out of character when I was around people. We've all had these experiences, I think, of depersonalization and derealization and things that could be given like a clinical pathological diagnosis or something. And as this was happening at the same time, I'd liked writing as a kid. One of the first things I said I wanted to do was be a writer, and that came back with a vengeance. That came back, and one of the first stories I wrote was an early version of Teeth, which is the first story in my Dark Awakenings collection about a guy, a philosophy grad student, who is introduced to the reality of metaphysical horror. And it sort of was like it didn't occur consciously until it had already happened. I suddenly realized that what had happened for me was that my very creative drive had sort of collapsed together with this thing that was horrifying me beyond any boundaries that I had ever known could happen. And that was at the same time deepening for me my understanding and experience of the religious ideas that I had grown up with and was reading about. So it's not a very far step from there to me to think, we've all heard of the muse, and more of us now have heard of the idea of like the genius or the demon or the daimon or the daemon as a guiding figure. At some point it all clicked, but I think it clicked for me unconsciously, and I realized I was writing from the same center of whatever it was that was embodying itself as that shadow figure. And I was having that drive my creativity like a muse. Then later I realized it consciously, and that's what sort of led me to be writing about demonic creativity. And I found out when I started doing it, I launched the demonmuse.com website in 2009, that there's like this simmering cultural interest in it. Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote Eat, Pray, Love, has that TED Talk about the exact same thing that people are just nuts over. And all the stuff that Daniel Pinchbeck is doing and talking about Quetzalcoatl.
Well, and this, that kind of
right
takes it. That takes it to this other place, which I don't want to get all New Agey and kooks town, put on my crazy pants, but that takes it to kind of the idea of channeling. And I know, there's some channeling stuff where it's like, okay, this is just ridiculous. But then there's this thing that happens where people say they're channeling these entities. So then it goes back to the identity of these daemons, right? Who is this consciousness? Is it like one thing? Is it a bunch of different guys? Is it like, is there just one uber spirit that does it? But then you talk to people and they're like, I'm channeling this entity from planet Venus, and then they write like hundreds of books that are channeled from this higher mind, like you said, like this other kind of place that you go to, and then all this information comes out. You could be like,
right, and they're just as much fundamentalists as anybody else too. Yes.
Totally, and it runs across the board, and there's some that could be considered malevolent, and there's some that are considered helpful. And what do you think about that?
Are kind of dumb.
Yeah, some of them are.
That's one of the amazing things. Like, if you look at the channeling material and the culture of channeling in light of the idea that there, in some sense, are these demonic inspirers,
right?
These forms of apparent entity that can inspire words, inspire writing, inspire visions, etc. That, it's clear that like a lot of them are mediocre, and that they're not interesting. They're repetitive.
No,
they're wrong, dumb in a lot of the ways. And so it's interesting to approach it from the perspective of creativity rather than the perspective of religion with a capital R, belief, because then you're allowed a different set of sensibilities to come in and kind of go, well, whether or not the creatures behind Seth are real or not real, like those books are actually kind of interesting. They're kind of there's some parts of them that are well written. Some of them are very insightful. They're kind of edgy. They make shifts. And whereas a lot of other stuff is like almost like generic. It's like genre. You write horror is a genre of fiction. A lot of it is terrible because it's really repetitive. I've read this before. That's a cliche. I've read that cliche before. I can't stand reading this text anymore because it's so boring. And it's weird how it kind of overlaps this sort of religious realm too, where a lot of this kind of material is produced that way is also sort of generic, and then some of it is really inspired and really kind of kind of creative. So there's something redemptive, again, about, or a dark redemption, if you will, because there's no real answer, about the creative approach to this. It's not like, the shadow figure was telling you to found a new religion or to create an absolute philosophical claim. It was like you realized that writing was the appropriate response to those experiences and ones that go on and then have meaning in the world outside.
Interesting. I think your sort of your analysis of it there and your diagnosis that I think is dead on. That's a good way of putting it, and that all kind of hinges on, or that brings out the fact that what you said about the whether or not aspect, what you're both talking about, the divide and the tension between just buying wholesale as a literal belief, whatever is presenting itself to you, and remaining skeptical about it, that issue is at once the most important question about the whole thing and the most irrelevant one that can take you in the wrong direction if you decide to make it the conscious focus of everything. I've been a Robert Anton Wilson fan for years and years and years, and I think you both are as well.
Yeah.
Last year I went back and reread Cosmic Trigger, and I hadn't read it for years. And it astonished me when I realized how much that book had probably subconsciously programmed me in some of my thinking and experiences here, because the whole thing I had forgotten. I remembered parts of it, but I forgot that the whole thing was structured around the narrative of Bob Wilson's own years-long experience of riding that divide between believing that he was actually in contact with some form of quote-unquote higher intelligence and viewing all possible other explanations and explainings away and reductions of it, right, to just pure material psychology or to the holy guardian angel or to just the unconscious mind as conventionally conceived. And for a while he thought he was speaking to some intelligence from the Sirius star and so on and so forth. The holy guardian angel was in there. I'm reading this Cosmic Trigger 1 and going, oh my God, that's exactly what I'm talking about. There's like this fruitful tension when you inhabit that middle point and say, look, the experience is real. And I can validly see how you could elaborate outwards from it a belief system that apparently, from the first-person point of view, if you stick with what you have personally seen, known, experienced, and what you are lying to yourself about, if you try to step aside from and view in an objective third-person point of view, if you stay with it, you could reasonably elaborate it out into an infinite number of explanations, some of which would be explaining it away, as it were, and some of which would be attributing it an actual ontological reality of its own. Well, what do you do with that? Well, what I say is my experience and my thinking both have said in the realm of both life direction and creative artistic direction to actively engage with it as if it really is the muse and the genius of the classical notions, and as if it is, in fact, like a higher self or higher intelligence of the spiritual traditions, while remaining totally self-aware of the fact that I don't know this, that this just works.
Well,
is actually a fruitful thing.
I totally agree with that, and I think that is what you can do with it. But along those lines, I mean, there are people that follow those higher voices, and they become like, like Son of Sam. They follow these things like that's their thing, and then they do horrible things. But then, under everything else, that's just part of nature, and they're only kind of, I guess, being the great white sharks. But, I mean, that's my problem sometimes is when you get those things and they sound crazy, then it's like, well, do you just go with it? Or, like, how do you separate between, like, delusion and your higher mind, do you think?
Well, that is the question, isn't it? And it's harder than it would seem because the very nature of delusion is such that the person who is deluded doesn't realize it, right? And obviously there are organic brain conditions and biological conditions that can lead to wrong thinking, and there are pathologies, I think, for real. But at the same time, if we then want to say that all of it boils down to that, and we need to just like medicate people or something to get rid of those things, you're cutting off the same thing that has given us all this human art and spirituality and religion. Some would say, hey, great, that's the spirituality and religion, the Dawkinses of the world and so on. But my inclination, and I'm afraid I'm too glib when I think in these directions, is to say that many times when somebody has their guiding muse or whatever they want to call it, their demon muse, turning into a Son of Sam type, dictating demon, actually, D-E-M-O-N, that there is a mistaken relationship between them. You can turn the daemonic or the more holistic, nurturing, guiding force into the purely evil demonic force by doing what we were talking about earlier, by basically trying to separate things that ultimately are not separated. There's a psychologist named Stephen Diamond who wrote a book called Anger and the Daemonic, and he writes a column now about it for Psychology Today titled Evil Deeds, and his whole career has been about exploring how this happens, and he both meets with clients and writes books. He was a student of Rollo May's, and he's big on pointing out that this same thing that is the source of creativity, and we have to view it as this is the source of creative energy from the unconscious mind, can be turned into an evil demon if we, in our conscious selves, fail to relate to it adequately, or if we repress it or mangle it with our cultural institutions or our self-talk or our specific ways of relating. So there's like an argument in favor of sort of avoiding the demon by embracing it and recognizing that if it's seeming like a demon, then it's something that you are doing wrong in relating to it. So again, my principle of trying to relate to it as something that I am in relationship with comes
right. And that Carl Jung said that it's the demons you don't talk to that make you sick.
Exactly. That's kind of the basic point ever since Freud and even earlier. Whatever it is that you don't deal with and whatever it is that you just kind of repress and cast into the inner darkness or outer darkness, however you want to frame it, of your own unconsciousness, basically takes on a life of its own. I mean, that's what a complex is, right? Is this independent nexus of problems in the psyche that is sort of flooding consciousness with emotions and motivations and so on that it can't deal with. Maybe one way of dealing with it, I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, one way of dealing with it might be to actively engage it as something living, something intelligent, see how it works. And I don't, by the way, I don't talk to verbally anything like my demon muse, and nor do I actually receive dictation. It's more like me focusing on, well, where the heck do my ideas and motivations come from? And it seems external to me. That's how I interact with this thing.
Do you do things to cultivate that, or do you just sort of remain open to it? Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not.
The latter option. I actually have a meditative practice and very generic and so on, but that's not for purposes of like receiving ideas and such. It's more like in the act of actually sitting down to write something or study something, I just remain open to the leading of where my thoughts go and all that, and I've noticed that my whole life it's been independent. The thing that like the Zen people might call the mad monkey, the monkey mind, that kind of thing, if you pay attention, can actually turn into something much deeper, a voice that is saying something that over time starts to show more of an internal coherence than you might expect.
Yeah, that's great, and I really like the mention of Robert Anton Wilson. I think we'll be doing some shows on him coming up later this fall, and in fact, I'm going to do a webinar with the Maybe Logic Academy folks on Cosmic Trigger, or particularly the first the first volume, which for me also is a touchstone. Although I haven't read it for many years, so it'll be very interesting to read it again, and thinking a lot about this zone, this in-between zone, this as-if space, which, and since we haven't spoken a lot about fiction, about the value not just for entertainment but for self-understanding and even for a kind of spirituality of H.P. Lovecraft and Thomas Ligotti and other writers of metaphysical horror, if you will, is that once you start opening up that as-if space, then it also changes the world of fiction and art. It's suddenly the numinous that can be in art and writing and music and all this is not just sort of a artistic parody or artifice based on some other world of religious possibility, but itself becomes a kind of site of potential meanings, experiences, encounters, and in a way it opens up your eye. And a lot of the time it's still just fiction, just genre, it's just some Hollywood movie, but with the right frame of mind that's open to this middle space you talk about, there might be one image, one shot, one word that sets you in motion along this path of kind of deeper inspiration. So it's also a very rich way of opening up the meanings of fiction.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you. I happen to agree with you. And if you start to look at the history of creative endeavor as the history of people who have wittingly or unwittingly been speaking with something, whether you want to frame it as quote-unquote just their unconscious minds or some other wider force or motivation, then you see a whole lot of different meanings in it. And you can, I think myself, I actually derive greater enjoyment and insight from reading some of my favorite authors and thinking about, well, what can I learn about them and about the world by noticing how it would seem that they were driven helplessly by these ideas that took over their lives. It's actually very poignant to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on that tip, we got to wind up here. What's coming up for you in terms of your next books, fictions, etc.?
Well, I have a book that will be coming out probably next year from Hippocampus Press. I just signed the contract on that about a week ago, and it will be titled To Rouse Leviathan, and it actually will be a book purely of fiction, but what it's going to do is have all of the contents of my first book, Divinations of the Deep, and all of the fiction that is in my second book, Dark Awakenings, along with some previously uncollected stories. And that will be out next year from Hippocampus. And there's a very good chance, it's likely that the year after that, I will actually have a book of nonfiction of my essays and papers and so on, exploring these kinds of matters. And as I think you also know, I turned what was my personal blog for several years into a blog magazine of ideas. I call it a blog of ideas in the age of apocalypse. I did that a few months ago. It's The Teeming Brain, and it's at teemingbrain.com. And I have a gallery of excellent writers writing about these matters and writing about the paranormal and society and culture and science and reductionism and materialism. One of them is David Metcalf, who was a guest of yours on this show just not too long ago.
Well, that's
so
wonderful, Matt. There's lots of stuff there. And, of course, there's mattcardin.com, so you can check out your stuff there. And thanks again for being on Expanding Mind.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you very much, Erik and Nadja.
All right. From Majamid, all you out there, keep your minds open.